Welcome to the annual Douglas Day Lecture. Thank you for being here. We're here together. First and foremost, a deep debt of gratitude must be extended to today's many sponsors, donors, organizers, descendants, tradition bearers, and vendors, creatives, aspiring freedom fighters, those among us as well as those who were unable to share in this beautiful experience. In no uncertain terms, the man, intellectual, and force that we are gathered to remember was the defiant champion of truth. Our hosts, the Talbot County Free Library, have been unwavering in honoring his example and will celebrate 100 years of service in 2025. I'm Jaelon Moaney, Deputy Director of the Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience at Washington College, and the youngest appointed by Maryland's first Black governor to the Commission on African American History and Culture. As a proud fellow son of Talbot and a lifelong wanderer of this magnetic space, it is a great privilege to introduce our keynote speaker today. Keidrick Roy is a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows and a faculty associate at Harvard's Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics, working at the intersection of American history, literature, and political thought from the Revolutionary era to the present. His scholarship has been featured in many places, among them CBS Sunday Morning, which I'll be tuning into tomorrow, Harvard Gazette, the Public News Service, Christian Science Monitor, Chicago Review of Books, the National Football League, and HBO. In addition to award-winning interdisciplinary scholarship in modern intellectual history, new literary history, English literary history, and American political thought, Dr. Roy has also been committed to the work of museum curation and documentary film production to encourage public reflection and dialogue like we are engaging in right now. Given his indelible mark as the project lead for an exhibition that put the writings of African Americans from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement in conversation with contemporary Black writers and thinkers at the American Writers Museum in Chicago, the gravity of this moment beckons a consideration of then Minister Resident and Consul General Douglas's 1893 expression of resolve in relation to the United States' latest spew of hate towards the world's first Black-led republic, the first independent Caribbean state, and the second independent state in the Western Hemisphere, Haiti, the anchor of this year's One Maryland, One Book title. At the age of 75, the diplomat delivered a soul-stirring address at the dedication of the Haitian Pavilion at the World's Columbian Exposition, otherwise known as the World's Fair. It took place on Naval Fairgrounds designated the White City and visited by more than 27 million over a brief period of 5 months. Seldom has there been a moment in recent history where the fervor and moral compass of Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey felt more apt for the hour in which the democracy finds itself than now. He advocates, but a deeper reason for the coolness between the countries is this: Haiti is Black, and we have not yet forgiven Haiti for being Black, or forgiven the Almighty for making her Black. I am a friend of Haiti and a friend of every other people upon whom the yoke of slavery has been imposed. Though she creeps rather than walks, stumbles often and sometimes falls, her head is not broken, and she still lives and grows. I predict will yet be tall and strong. Out of division, we will come a desire for union. Out of weakness, a desire for strength. Out of ignorance, a desire for knowledge. And out of stagnation will come a desire for progress. It's both a reckoning and humane reverberation for each of us. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Roy.
right. Thank you so much, Jaelon, for that incredible introduction. Thank you as well to today's organizers, the Frederick Douglass Honor Society Board, especially to Debbie Dotson for bringing me out here for this in-person gathering. I've been able to participate in the Douglass Day virtually since the pandemic, but I am glad to be here in the flesh finally, to walk in the places where Douglass has walked, and to be among all of you who I've seen online, but now I can actually see in person. So there's a variety of topics that I could have discussed today in honor of Frederick Douglass, a great American hero. I could have narrated his life and times, how he was born in slavery in 1818, escaped to freedom 20 years later, delivered his first speech to an interracial audience on the island of Nantucket in 1841, and thus launched his abolitionist career. I could have discussed how he developed under the influence of famed abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, and how he remained in Garrison's intellectual camp throughout the 1840s, a camp that saw the US government as being so irredeemable that political solutions to eradicating slavery were inconceivable. I could have demonstrated how Douglass's future embrace of the Constitution and as an anti-slavery document in the 1850s served to mark his turn toward the Liberty Party and eventually the Republican Party that Lincoln would helm during the Civil War in the 1860s. I could have described Douglass's recruitment of Union Army soldiers throughout the Civil War and his relentless activism for racial and gender equality until his dying day in 1895. However, instead of discussing these increasingly well-known turning points in Douglass's life, I want to share with you a version of Douglass I describe in my new book, American Dark Age, Racial Feudalism, and the Rise of Black Liberalism. It asks two questions. One, what did it mean to be an enlightened liberal in the United States before the 20th century? And two, what's race got to do with it? Since the nation's founding, prominent thinkers associated with the American liberal tradition, from Thomas Jefferson to Frederick Douglass, debated the virtue of liberal ideas, such as individual rights, human equality, moral frameworks that extend beyond particular cultures, and the belief in the possibility of progress. They did not necessarily endorse liberalism in the sense now commonly equated with extreme individualism and unfettered free markets that ignore the collective good. Instead, they frequently contrasted their liberal values with contemptuous references to feudalism, which is the opposite of liberalism. Beyond this, the idea of feudalism, for some, took on distinctly racial characteristics during the first half of the 19th century. So today, I'll draw on American Dark Age to examine the long-standing dominance of American racial feudalism in part one of my talk, the equal and opposite defiance of Douglass and other Black liberals in part two, and the lasting durability of Black liberal ideas and how they apply to today's politics in part three. Parts one and two are primarily historical, so if contemporary politics are on your mind, your patience will be rewarded in the end. Don't worry, I won't say anything too controversial. Good? Okay, all right. All right. So part one, what was feudalism? During the late 1700s, the founding generation was abuzz with condemnations of feudalism and feudal law. Luminaries such as Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Noah Webster, and Thomas Paine attacked abuses that they saw in Europe and the fledgling United States as throwbacks to feudalism. To be sure, Jefferson gained political prominence during the Revolutionary era as the author of a 1774 document that conspicuously criticized the feudal tenures, feudal burdens, and family of princes that dominated Britain's past as he contextualized the political overreaches of King George III and the British Parliament. As you'll remember from history, American patriots assailed parliamentary policies that taxed the colonies without giving them political representation. There was also the Stamp Act of 1765, the Tea Act of 1773, and the Enhanced Quartering Act of 1774, and a range of other abuses that got the colonists up in arms. Shortly after America declared independence in 1776, Jefferson authored economic legislation from the floor of the Virginia House of Delegates against the practices of primogeniture and entail, where all the family's wealth would go to the firstborn male. Dissolving primogeniture and entail, in his view, would abolish the, quote, feudal and unnatural distinctions still present in Virginia. Jefferson praised this and other 18th century laws that he wrote as, quote, forming a system by which every fiber would be eradicated of ancient or future aristocracy and a foundation laid for a government truly Republican. As it comes, though Jefferson celebrated the abolition of feudalism, what he saw as William the Conqueror's imposition of social, political, and religious hierarchy after the Norman conquest of England in 1066 that ended Anglo-Saxon rule, he was not wholly free of sympathies for medieval times. In fact, Jefferson took great interest in the history of England before 1066. In John Adams's telling, Jefferson even wanted America's national seal to feature the image of Hengst and Horsa. That's the medieval Anglo-Saxon chiefs. Early Americans understood the medieval period, or what is pejoratively called the Dark Ages, as roughly the 1,000-year period between the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century and the rise of the Renaissance in the 15th century. In any case, for Jefferson and the other founders, notions of medieval feudalism, such as vassalage, serfdom, homage, crusades, and dark ages, often signaled three related concepts: artificial hierarchies, arbitrary violations of natural rights and freedoms outlined in the Declaration of Independence and codified in the US Constitution, and abuses of political power perpetuated by a tyrannical governing authority. Now that we have discussed the historically constructed meaning of feudalism, what do I mean by racial feudalism? Despite Jefferson's celebratory claims about removing the final vestiges of feudalism from his corner of the New World, African Americans continued to face artificial hierarchies preserved by slavery in the South and prejudice in the North. Many prominent Black abolitionists, like the patriots of the founding era, also drew on feudal metaphors to characterize the conditions of slavery and social subordination. However, unlike Jefferson and the other founders, eminent Black Americans described their perception of the feudal vestiges on US soil in relation to racial hierarchy, rooted in, one, the humiliations of paternalism, or being thought of or treated as a child, regardless of your age, and bound in a relationship that's defined by obedience in exchange for protection. Two, notions of mutual obligation that weren't really mutual. And three, false claims of a natural pecking order that artificially relegated Black people to the bottom. The language they used and the illiberal foundations it unmasked comprise what I call racial feudalism. Specific examples abound. In 1827, for example, a Black minister named Nathaniel Paul questioned the integrity of America's founding ideas while there were, quote, no less than 1,500,000 human beings still in a state of unconditional vassalage, end quote. And a vassal, by the way, is a subordinate tenant in the feudal system that owes homage and allegiance to a superior lord. 10 years later, African-American philosopher Hosea Easton contended that US racial hierarchy emerged after, quote, European slavery under the feudal system, where slaves were fixed to the soil. In 1847, the fugitive slave and author of the first Black American novel, William Wells Brown, wondered aloud, quote, Shall the American people be behind the people of the old world? Shall they be behind those who are represented as almost living in the dark ages? For him, racial slavery has, quote, given the serfs of the old world an opportunity of branding the American people the most tyrannical people upon God's footstool. Also, in 1847, in a speech to an audience in Coventry, England, Frederick Douglass, perhaps the most famous abolitionist in US history, took great pains to describe the, quote, skin aristocracy in America. No, not exactly the skin. It was the color of the skin that was the mark of distinction and the brand of degradation. Douglass later told his Boston audience, quote, I could have easily stayed in England if I had sought for ease, undisturbed and unannoyed by American skin aristocracy, end quote. Likewise, he compared the conditions Black people faced in the United States during the 1850s to, quote, all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world. He even likened his Maryland plantation to, quote, what the baronial domains were during the Middle Ages in Europe. And baronial domains refer to spaces that are controlled by lower-level medieval landholders called barons. Underscoring these notions, John Mercer Langston, the first Black congressional representative from Virginia, would claim shortly after the post-Civil War Reconstruction era that, quote, the tendency toward political thought in the South has always been towards an aristocracy and feudal institutions. The right of a few to govern, the right being founded upon wealth, landed estates, and consequent social positions and influence. Meanwhile, during the antebellum era, Black Americans also equated the US military's treatment of Native peoples and Mexicans to medieval campaigns. Hosea Easton, for example, resoundingly condemned the, quote, late unholy war with the Indians and the wicked crusade against the peace of Mexico during the 1830s. Along these lines, African-American abolitionist Martin Delany excoriated the future US President Zachary Taylor in an 1849 letter to Frederick Douglass. Denouncing Taylor's supporters, he told Douglass, quote, the extent to which the American people carry this glorification of military crusaders is beyond parallel. The extent to which this homage is carried ceases to be respectful, since it is neither kind nor complimentary. But like the homage of the serf to the noble or the vassal to the lord, it is ludicrous. Racial feudalism and pro-slavery thought. Contrary to Black abolitionists' damning critiques of feudalism and its associated concepts during the first half of the 19th century, many white pro-slavery thinkers from that period celebrated what historian and sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois himself assailed as American feudalism. From the halls of Congress and state legislatures to the lecture stages in colleges and the pages of agricultural journals, they lobbied for legislation and supported institutions that would attempt to recreate in law and culture a society that mirrored their fantasies of a feudal past, with Black people now serving as the peasants of the lowest caste. They consciously deployed the nostalgic language of feudalism as a political smokescreen to obscure their moves to consolidate the cultural, political, and economic power that would sustain their elevated social positions and the collective ascendancy of their race. In 1836, US Representative James Henry Hammond bellowed in the halls of Congress that American slavery retained the advantages of the aristocracy of the old world. He claimed that, quote, slavery does indeed create an aristocracy of talents, of virtue, of generosity, and courage. In a slave country, every free man is an aristocrat. In 1854, George Fitzhugh, a pro-slavery Southern ideologue, echoed associations that many slavery supporters were making between European feudalism and American slavery, writing, quote, look to the old patriarchs and their slaves, to the feudal lords and their vassals, or come to the South and see our farms. Several years later, pro-slavery advocate J. Quitman Moore wrote an article in a widely circulated Southern periodical, the DuBose Review, entitled Feudalism in America. In it, he sighingly questions if, quote, the feudal spirit will ever be revived on the Western continent again. Even so, Moore writes that, quote, feudalism is a social and political authority founded upon the subjugation of a weaker by a more powerful race. He contends, quote, Southern society revived the genius of medieval civilization and even surpassed it because it imposed a racial hierarchy confirmed by ideas grounded in science. He reimagines the old world feudal order as racial feudalism in America. And of course, we can see remnants of such notions of racial feudalism in different forms after the Civil War. The Ku Klux Klan intentionally reclaimed images of the medieval world, as did prominent Americans such as US Poet Laureate Alan Tate, who wrote in 1929 that, quote, philosophically, we must go the whole hog of reaction and base our movement less on the actual Old South than upon its prototype, the historical, social, and religious schemes of Europe. We must be the last Europeans, there being no Europeans in Europe at present. Today, medievalisms appear in the writings of mass shooters committed to notions of racial purity, as can be seen in the recent manifesto of the Christchurch, New Zealand shooter, where he makes over 650 references to knights, as well as in the manifesto of the mass shooter in my hometown of El Paso, Texas. Medievalist images were also on display in the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, and at the Capitol riots on January 6, 2021. And you can see the Knights Templar cross, that image there, and right here as well. The Middle Ages also takes pride of place in the writings of far-right thinkers such as Milo Yiannopoulos, and in the thinking of mainstream politicians such as Donald Trump. Indeed, the former president fancied the border wall to be a medieval solution to the border crisis. So this is all to say that there's the idea of medievalism is very much a part of our DNA as who we are as Americans, and we need to wrestle through what that means, that it appears in many different ways, in many different forms, and through different people. And part of what this book tries to do is untangle what that impulse is. Part 2, the defiance of Black liberalism. Now that I have described the prevalence of the ideology of racial feudalism and the fanciful notions about the medieval world that continue to appear today, I will turn to 4 ways in which Black liberals worked to oppose racial feudalism in their time before the Civil War. But first, let me take a step back to discuss how Jefferson's prejudices limited his ability to embrace the full and true sense of liberal ideas championed by prominent Black Americans. As mentioned earlier, in the history of American political thought, Thomas Jefferson is perhaps the most celebrated for distilling the American liberal tradition in the Declaration of Independence that he drafted, which levied potent critiques against the British monarchy and its alleged illiberal tyrannical rule of American colonists. Summarizing his longstanding criticisms, Jefferson penned a letter to George Washington in 1791, where he claimed, quote, I certainly never made a secret of my being anti-monarchical and anti-aristocratical, end quote. Though Jefferson trumpeted his rejection of the artificial aristocracy of the old world order because it created feudal and unnatural distinctions, he remained committed to perpetuating a, quote, natural aristocracy of virtue and talent in the New World. However, within this framework, Jefferson maintained doubts about the natural intellectual capabilities of Black people, which would necessarily deny them entry into this ruling class of the virtuous and the talented. The patent tensions among race, liberty, and governance in Jefferson's writings allowed his uncertainty regarding Black people to be read as a tacit license to conflate the promotion of a natural aristocracy of virtue and talent on the one hand, and an exclusionary racial feudal aristocracy limited to people with white skin on the other. Indeed, in Jefferson's wake, many prominent US statesmen openly advocated for a natural aristocracy tied to the conditions of permanent racial hierarchy through direct or oblique references to Jefferson's writings, including Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, US Vice President and Senator John C. Calhoun, and US Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger B. Taney. However, many Black Americans worked to renovate and expand liberal ideas in the United States by drawing on intellectual traditions with deep roots in the 18th and 19th century, such as utilitarianism, which supports, in broad terms, the greatest good for the greatest number of people, classical liberalism, which emphasizes freedom from external interference, and reform liberalism, which leans more heavily toward correcting social structures that limit individual flourishing and has an eye toward a collective good. To be sure, early Black liberals underscored the importance of fostering a government in which everyone, including women, could participate through universal suffrage, thus ending the persistence of what Douglas labeled aristocratic rule. Liberal ideas for them were not definitionally synonymous with the laissez-faire economic policy that Karl Marx and other socialists have attributed to the excesses of capitalism. Rather, many Black American liberals were more ideologically aligned with their white counterparts who declared America's early constitutional frameworks, quote, the most liberal in the world, with the crucial caveats that, as one writer put it in 1781, it was glaringly inconsistent on issues regarding slavery and prejudice, which is, of course, an understatement. So I'll briefly point out how Douglas and other Black abolitionists took up, elaborated, and transformed liberal ideas since the opening decades of the 19th century by organizing their attitudes and actions around 4 principles. I talk about 6 in the book. First principle, the political philosophy of Black American liberalism was anti-feudal, anti-prejudice, and deeply committed to the advancement of women's rights, including the right to vote. Though European and American liberal thinkers since the late 18th century mainly rejected feudal hierarchies, many had been accused of eliding questions of race or gender, questions which Douglas and other antebellum Black liberals explicitly and forcefully confronted. I'll return to this point shortly. Second principle, because of their commitment to realizing the aims and claims of America's founding documents, most Black American liberals remained anti-colonizationist. That is, they opposed the various schemes promoting the involuntary, and thus illiberal, expulsion of Black people from America, a nation that they saw as their home. Instead, they chose to remain in place and to strive to make the United States live up to its stated precepts, even if it meant subjecting the nation to critique and themselves to danger. They had what Frederick Douglass described as, quote, sufficient faith in the people of the United States to believe that a Black person can ever get justice on American soil. Third principle. As mentioned, the practical philosophy of Black American liberals balanced the tenets of reform liberalism and aspects of classical liberalism. It operated through a critique of the existing order from within, rather than assuming the necessity of its wholesale destruction. For Black liberals, the idea of progress does not blindly assume its inevitability. Instead, they raise their pens and their voices to secure liberty through calculated political reforms. At the same time, they work toward self-improvement through intellectual and spiritual development. All this is not to say that Black reformers rejected the idea of staging a political revolution when necessary to abolish entrenched systemic evils. Douglass, for example, recognized the need for such a break from the existing order to abolish slavery and extend the benefits of the American liberal project to all. He welcomed the Civil War as an abolition war that would guarantee, quote, liberty for all and chains for none. Fourth principle, Black American liberals understood their political outlook as compatible with secular political principles alongside Christian spiritual and moral teachings. Indeed, Douglass and other Black abolitionists condemned slavery's illiberal architecture by presenting the institution as the limit case for notions of Christianity and common sense notions of justice and fairness that we might call universal morality today. Though Black liberals did not stipulate that the public must share their religious faith, they believed that transforming America's racially coded statutes and customs could only be brought about through the moral advancement of the United States and its people. Without moral transformation, political changes to laws and leaders would be impermanent and vulnerable to backsliding. Part 3, the durability of Black liberalism. 2 years after the Civil War, Frederick Douglass attacked the illiberal veto power, as well as the other executive powers President Andrew Johnson unscrupulously employed to perpetuate racial hierarchy. He contended that these were the remnants of social orders, quote, borrowed from the old world and bearing the character of monarchy or an aristocracy or an oligarchy that had actively been weakening America's republic. He also pointed to what he saw as the founders' adulteration of American liberal ideas, declaring that, quote, born as the fathers of this republic were, under monarchical institutions, they, very naturally, when they came to form a government, were disposed to blend something of an old error with the new truth, or of the newly discovered truth of liberty asserted in the Declaration of Independence. The founders gave us a constitution made in the shadow of slavery and of monarchy, and it thus contains features of both those unfavorable influences, end quote. Douglass then affirmed the object of his personal mission after the Civil War remained to free the United States by working to purge its constitution from everything that looks toward a monarchy, including all discriminations against any person, theoretically or practically, end quote. To make the nation, and this is to make the nation, in his words, conform to the great truths laid down by the fathers. Doing so, in Douglass's view, would establish a, quote, genuine republic that would keep no man from the ballot box, or the jury box, or the cartridge box because of his color, exclude no woman from the ballot box because of her sex. I'm happy to talk more about the cartridge box and free speech. I saw a thread this morning. Happy to return to that during Q&A. Okay. And yet Douglass still did not recognize the circumstances of oppression that Black people faced in the United States as evidence of unfreedom at the core of American liberal ideas. He also did not call for the dissolution of the United States, nor for the dismantling of its foundational principles. On the contrary, he advanced a variation of liberal ideas that, in his view, could practically overcome the racialized vestiges of feudalism. So to recap briefly, part 1 of the talk described racial feudalism as a dominant framework in the antebellum American era that had retained relevance in the present day. In part 2, I outlined some key elements of Black liberal ideas, including their anti-colonizationist beliefs, their reformist political philosophy, and their dedication to personal and collective moral improvement to sustain political change. In this final part, I'll zoom in on one of Frederick Douglass's ideas that points to the present day applicability of the 19th century Black liberal tradition. Therefore, I'll depart from the historical narrative I've been painting to give you a little taste of Douglas's importance to contemporary political philosophy, in part to demonstrate how important his thinking remains to so many fields of study today. All right, as I argue in the book, there are three approaches to balancing competing interests in our 21st century liberal democracy, made up of individuals with commitments to various group identities. I resist what I call identity-blind and identity-driven ideas, and drawing on Frederick Douglass, champion what I call his identity-aware alternative. An identity-blind or ID-blind approach to allocating resources in a democratic society holds that racial or gender considerations should have no place in public policy decisions. However, this stance can ignore or minimize the historical forces that distinctively shape the experiences of people in particular groups. An identity-driven or ID-driven approach, which sees foregrounding the needs of one's identity group, as a Black person, say, or a woman, as central to effective policymaking, tends to view the world through a lens that can obscure the importance of coalitions that cut across multiple group experiences and practically get legislation passed. The identity-aware, or ID-aware, approach that I advance recognizes the impact of historical forces on particular identity groups and finds ways to link individuals to broad-based alliances in a manner that Douglass practiced and championed. It seeks to create space for discussing differences without valorizing or trivializing group identity. I'll detail each of these approaches in turn. The ID-blind approach is usually associated with thinkers such as American philosopher John Rawls. The Jamaican philosopher Charles Mills and others have criticized identity-blind frameworks as being insufficient because they fail to take into account the history of group discrimination, such as racism, patriarchy, and so on. In Mills's view, this results in the false perception that everyone begins from an equal starting point. As a collective, opponents of identity-blind frameworks like Mills believe that their inherent failure to acknowledge race or racial difference leaves us unable to recognize racism and its cumulative effects. These effects, in their view, require corrective measures. On the other hand, identity-driven approaches are supported by some, though certainly not all, proponents of what is called standpoint epistemology. Now, standpoint epistemology is the idea that oppressed people have some degree of privileged access to knowledge. And this belief, in my view, has validity. However, at its most extreme position, some advocates of standpoint epistemology could assert that one's identity as a Black person or as a woman or as an immigrant, for example, gives them unique access to knowledge that is not available to other groups. Such an approach would reject the possibility of mutual understanding and claim, because you are not my identity, you cannot understand my struggle. Princeton philosopher Lidal Dror has critiqued those holding this more hardline approach to standpoint epistemology. He argues that to accept the premise that some things about oppression cannot be known outside of a particular group lets people in dominant groups off the hook by allowing them to claim ignorance of their misdeeds because they simply cannot understand the perspective of the marginalized. To avoid the pitfalls of identity-blind and identity-driven positions that I've just described, I read Dror's critique and of hardline versions of standpoint epistemology alongside Frederick Douglass's antebellum political ideas. Douglass's 3 autobiographies took identity seriously while, at the same time, recognizing the need to let other people into his experience for their education and elevation. In this way, he offers what I call an identity-aware solution. Across his autobiographies, for example, Douglas recounts asking himself a series of queries as a child, all of which include the central refrain, "Why am I a slave?" For reasons I explain in the book, Douglas's recollection and repetition of this specific question suggests its importance to his outlook. The act of asking, "Why am I a slave?" foregrounds a moral question that begins to expose the social dynamics governing his position as an individual with black skin, living in a particular historical context and geographic location that allows slavery to exist, and for him to be rendered as a being that another person could enslave. Following Douglas, by beginning our own political deliberations with the question, why am I considered X in a society, in this society, where X can stand for an American, a black American, a white American, a dreamer, wealthy, poor, etc., inasmuch as our society assigns a particular value to individuals by way of such labels, can help us begin to see the advantages and limitations of our socially constructed positions. Also central to the identity-aware approach that Douglas sanctions is his belief that an individual's experience as part of a particular group can be communicated and understood by people outside of that group. Indeed, those very people could take positive political action or form coalitions based on their intergroup knowledge. Douglas invoked his identity and his experience across thousands of speeches to audiences of different races and nationalities. His intentional efforts underscore his fundamental commitment to the principle of mutual understanding, and importantly, his implicit belief in the possibility that progress can be achieved through the exchange of human experiences. We just have to be willing to listen. Now I'll conclude with this. In his path-breaking book, A Theory of Justice, John Rawls advances a thought experiment featuring an original position behind what he calls a veil of ignorance, under ideal circumstances that encourages questions such as, how might we establish a social system in which skin color does not matter? However, Douglas allowed for an identity-aware question with an alternative preamble. Given that we live in a society in which skin color continues to shape one's social outcomes, why am I a slave? Moreover, what might this condition mean for how I conceptualize political ideas and how I can bring others to see the world from my perspective? Embracing an identity-aware frame that takes one's socially imposed position seriously allows us to avoid the pitfalls of identity-blind approaches that ignore race or gender. It also frees us from the challenges of identity-driven propositions that can alienate potential allies outside of narrowly defined groups in diverse democracies. Furthermore, Douglas's identity-aware affirmation of mutual understanding recognizes that people can learn from perspectives held by those that are not like themselves through the exchange of ideas and experiences. So today, I've shared a little bit about how my forthcoming book highlights the contributions of Frederick Douglass and other Black American liberals to the American political tradition, where their status as equal contributors has long been overlooked. Moreover, I've shown how readers will come away with knowledge of a distinctive constellation of thinkers who remained actively involved in creating political change by criticizing the remnants of feudalism in the United States. Remnants I've shown to be ever present in our modern era. Together, Black liberals worked to root out the causes of racial subordination and inequality through political processes grounded in the principles of America's founding documents. They all recognized that while the arc of the moral universe is long, it did not necessarily bend toward justice without applying the pressure of moral and political appeals and fostering public dialogue across stark lines of division. While much can be learned from what historian and political theorist Cedric Robinson has labeled the Black radical tradition, my book aims to give readers an alternative framework. It spotlights the early Black American tradition that Douglass exemplified, which tested, reformed, and ultimately embraced the promise of America. Thank you.
I think it's very clear with each of the three parts that Dr. Roy's scholarship is as refreshing as it is actionable. So thank you again. I'll open this up after kicking off with one of my own. I've just been sitting over there trying to receive as much as I can. And the first thing that's coming to my mind is whether or not you might let us in on a bit more about your journey. What individual inflection point or range of experiences inspired American Dark Age?
Oh, thank you so much. Excellent question. So you might notice that I don't have an accent. Maybe there is something you can detect, but I'm from El Paso, Texas. I was born and raised there. My dad was in the military for 28 years in the U.S. Army. And I went to a military college in Colorado Springs, the Air Force Academy out there, and I served for 8 years. I was an intercontinental ballistic missile operator. I worked underground for 4 of the military years, and I taught English literature at the Air Force Academy. And so that teaching experience, having an attention to language, the way it operated, really gave me a love for reading and wrestling with what Douglass had to say and his insights in ways that I might have missed if I had a purely historical education. But it wasn't until I left the military in 2017 and went on to pursue my Ph.D. at Harvard, where I did an interdisciplinary literature, political theory, and history studies there that really gave me a sense of what would later become this book. And so halfway through the dissertation program there in American Studies was my field. I began to encounter a lot of Enlightenment philosophy. So there's these proto-Enlightenment thinkers, John Locke, Francis Bacon, these other early thinkers in the 1600s who were trying to wrestle with the place of science in society. They wrestle with notions of progress, authority, ecclesiastical authority, so on and so forth. Then we move into the 1700s. There's David Hume, Immanuel Kant, these other kinds of writers that I was just enamored with. And I became interested in how Americans took up these ideas that the Enlightenment philosophers had. And I found that Thomas Jefferson was the centerpiece for what might be called an American Enlightenment tradition, especially in the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution, which is framed and written by others. And one of the oaths that I had to take in the military was to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and to bear true faith and allegiance to the same. And I started wondering, where are other Black thinkers on this spectrum? Surely there's a rich tradition of African Americans that were deeply committed to these ideals. And while there are bits and pieces of this in a variety of literature, I set out to write the dissertation, which framed all of these people in one place. So that's the Enlightenment side, and that book is coming out in a couple of years. I'm still working through working through some things on that, but it's under contract and it'll be out soon. But the underside of that was that many Enlightenment thinkers were pushing against something. They were trying to escape darkness. They're trying to escape. So you can't have Enlightenment without something before it. And it was that I keyed into for this first book, which examines the feudal or medieval underbelly that terrified so many Enlightenment thinkers, white and Black. And so that was the basis for this book.
Thank you. others. We have a hand in the
I
front.
have a question for you. How do you think, oh, how do you think Douglas would react to the retreat of affirmative action, especially as it relates to universities and colleges of higher learning, the one that you went to that's now pulling back, the one that I went to that's now pulling back, and saying we're not going to take that into consideration now with respect to people that are applying to these places, especially in the context of development, enlightenment, learning. What do you think he would say?
It's a great question. Try to get me in trouble. No. Excellent question. So I do address this in a footnote. If you look for it at the end of the book, I try to hide it. No, so it's interesting. So affirmative action, it's like something like 3/4 of all Black Americans support affirmative action, and about the same number of all Americans would rather see it no longer be in place. And something that I really keyed into Douglas as I was doing the research on him and his thought was that he was a very pragmatic and deliberate thinker, and he knew the fights that were worth taking up and those that are worth maybe letting go. And there's been a number of cases across the United States where these individual communities have taken up things like reparations, for example, and said, yeah, we'll do it in this particular context. Others haven't, because of redlining and some of the more recent manifestations of what Saidi Hartman called the afterlife of slavery. But in terms of affirmative action, I think that Frederick Douglass would look at would take an identity-aware approach. It would see, hey, how has race impacted the number of students in these colleges? What does that look like today? Amherst, for instance, when affirmative action was gotten rid of, they went from something like 13% of African-American students there down to 3%. I mean, and so I don't want to step outside of my lane, my historical lane here, but I would just look, I think Douglas would look very carefully at it and would look at the coalitions that would need to be formed in order to address these kinds of issues. I'll leave it there. Yeah. I'll talk to you after if you'd like.
Because Bud didn't keep.
Oh, I can hear you, Peter.
Thank you. This has deepened my already deep appreciation for Frederick Douglass as a reformer within the system, within the American experiment, for this faith in the self-correcting system of our constitutional democracy. That's a nuance that I really hadn't picked up on and fully understood. How do we reconcile his urgency, his expressed urgency for abolitionism, with his more incremental approach to the 15th Amendment and suffrage?
That's a great question. Great question. So I think what Douglas is able to do in the path that he outlines, just in his life and his work, he's able to recognize two modes of thinking. And we can see this form of thought recur in the debates between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois in the late 1800s, where Booker T. Washington is wanting to take a more leisurely approach well, he said he can remain separate as fingers. He had a complicated ideology, but Du Bois wanted integration, radical integration now. And so there are always these two modes of thought that I think are at tension. There's a immediacy which needs to be addressed, in which Douglass saw slavery, the abolition of slavery, as that. Like we cannot have another person in bondage for another second if we can help it. It is that terrible of a condition that I want no part of, and that the United States should have no part of. It violates its fundamental premises. But then there's also the need to make everything short of that. He's a realist. He wants to make progress, and he recognizes that it may not always be strategically sound to pair something that's deeply unpopular with something that actually needs to be done. So I think that the more that we look at Douglas's life and thought, the more we recognize the nuance of his thinking, and the more carefully we study him, we'll get a clearer sense ourselves of how to create the strategic coalitions that he was such a big fan of to improve the lot of everyone in the United States.
Oh, can I just ask it about that? Sorry, okay.
I don't really know how to phrase this question, but my thought train is something like, how does identity awareness, how does the concept of the pursuit of happiness, basic fairness, freedom for all, how do they factor in with the identity awareness? In other words, when decisions have to be made,
Yes.
how much are those factors taken into account?
Great question. Yes. As I was working through this theory, part of what I was pushing against was the impulse, the knee-jerk, whenever identity is raised, we can't talk about that. I don't, and I think that creates a type of poisonous politics that we have to work through and wrestle with, because everyone has a story. I was talking to Jaelon about this yesterday. Everyone has a story that we need to be sensitive to and to pay attention to. We all want to be seen and known, felt in some ways. We want to be treated with a sense of dignity. And this is at the core of Douglas's thinking. So when I talk about identity awareness and its application to contemporary politics, I think of the ways that we can look to preserve dignity, to not shut down things that may be uncomfortable to us, but at the same time, to share our stories in ways that assume that the other person is going to be willing to receive them. So it truly does take moral transformation on top of the political transformation to make this work. And so, I wish we could, more dialogues, more things like this, I think can help build those kinds of communities. Thank you.
All right. Okay. So you kind of touched on it briefly with Cedric Robinson, in because he's a radical.
Yes.
And so my question for you is you were talking about the three modes of thinking as far as the American experiment. I know one was the feudalism, the other one was like for the lack of a better word, I'll call it the isolationist concept, and then the one that's more inclusionary. So the question I really have is, why do so many people, regardless of race, tend to see Frederick Douglass the way they want to see him and not the way he actually was? Because he was a man of growth. For his first autobiography, he kind of wrote almost as an anarchist, which was the immediacy you were talking about. But as he matured, he was able to talk to everyone from, the operators of the Underground Railroad to Abraham Lincoln. It made him the man he was. Why do so many people ignore that part of him?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, it's complicated. With all great thinkers, I think of W.B. Du Bois again as another one who changes completely. There's a political. No, I'm not going to make a political quote. But there are. We need to. I grew up in Black church, Baptist church, all that. And we talked a lot about, her name, man. All right. Don't get me started. I have a microphone now. Like my Texas days. But there's when you're reading and interpreting the Bible, for instance, it's easy to pull out a scripture here, a scripture there. But there needs to be a reading that both appreciates the component of focus, like the sentence the verse that we're focusing on, and at the same time holds the broader biblical message in place as well. So it's hard, and this is why the fight over history, what gets taught to our children, for instance, is so strong today. I mean, there are ways of distorting Douglass completely, and in this book I really tried to do my best to read hermeneutically, like within Douglass's, across his entire life and speeches and all of that, and really emphasize what I feel he would have at that given moment in his life. But the fight over the teaching of history and different places across America is crucial, and it's huge for a reason, for the very reason that you mentioned. So thank you for bringing that to our collective attention. It's certainly worthy of reflection.
I just want to follow up on this question. So we had this transformation of Douglass over time from how he began. So how did he end? And where did he end, and how does it fit in with your three different concepts about identity?
Yes, as toward the end of Douglass's life, even up until his dying day, he was trying to make good on the promises of the founding documents. And yes, he has his pessimistic moments, just like all of us do. You turn on the news, regardless of your political persuasion, you're going to be disheartened at times. I even had a similar transformation in my own life, just in the wake of the 2010s, the shooting of unarmed black people. It's very hard to watch that being documented, and for me not to turn to something like Afro-pessimism and be like, this can't work. There's a fundamental antagonism, and so on and so forth. But I really feel that for people like Douglass, as he's seeing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment that he cherished, and its rights be eroded piece by piece by piece, post-Reconstruction era, once the military leaves the South, things dissolve. He's heartbroken over this. And so I think that we have to recognize his humanity in that, but I still believe across his writings he doesn't give up on what America could be. And that's where I like to place myself in that camp with Frederick Douglass.
Hi. Great to have you, Dr. Roy. I'm looking at the title of your book, American Dark Age, and I'm looking at racial feudalism and the rise of the black liberalism. You've done a great job talking about trend. One trend line is in decay, and the other is on the rise. I was wondering, is the crossover point here, now? Is it out there? Is the American Dark Age getting lighter, or is it neutral, or is it getting brighter? Thanks.
It's a good question. Just based on the reactions from the audience, I should let you all respond. No, it's a great question. First of all, I should point out that for appreciators of Southern comfort, this is on the bottle. What was on the bottle till they changed it? So I appropriated it for my purposes. So that's an Easter egg that hopefully too many people. This isn't being recorded, is it? No, it is. Okay. We're viral. We're good. Racial feudalism. I think an argument could be made that racial feudalism in its most virulent form, it goes underground after the abolition of slavery. And what I found to be interesting is that there are parts in history, and I trace this in the prologue of the book, just these nodes where people would just keep on touching on these feudal ideas, but in ways that marked racial hierarchy in ways that I was quite uncomfortable with, and so that's what I try to wrestle with. So, I certainly think that racial feudalism, in the sense that this book describes and tries to capture in the antebellum era, would look different. But your question about the rise of black liberalism, I think, is absolutely fascinating. Liberalism is interesting because in the antebellum era, it means one thing to be a liberal, kind of in the ways that I've discussed, this anti-feudal tradition that is very allergic to artificial hierarchies and really thinks that we should live in community in which everyone's treated the same kind of way. But as you look in the 20th century and beyond, liberalism changes. There are intersections with conservatism, and there's intersections with progressivism. There's neoliberalism, which champions free markets, globalization, privatization, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of versions of liberalism that's out there. And so what I'm trying to do in this book is just look at what these thinkers then were intending. But I would say that the liberal tradition is alive in America, and I'm not talking about the progressive tradition necessarily, but just the spirit of liberality that believes that we can come together under a rule of law and that we can support equal rights for all. Like, all of that has always been part of America's DNA. Our task here and now is to try to surface those pieces of our history. And what this book does is try to move in a step toward beginning to make that more salient for us in our present times.
Excuse me. I have a question.
Sorry.
So I know you talked about identity blind, identity driven, and identity aware. So when you think of the concept of white privilege, how does that relate to those concepts you just talked about?
Great question. Yeah, so I think that part of what Douglas helps us to do when he asks, why am I a slave? He puts the spotlight on his identity in a very particular kind of way that has a moral resonance to it. And in today's society, you might ask, why am I white? Do I have privilege? And if you begin to ask those questions and then review your life and the course of it to see when, in which ways these privileges might appear in your life, I think it can help to do some of the work that Douglas is trying to do in making us aware of our identities. So he has a really thoughtful approach, introspective approach that I'm trying to highlight that doesn't necessarily respond to every particular situation, but that can help each of us get at that universal solution through our particular positionality in society. Excellent questions. Thank you.
So can everyone hear me? Okay. So I was curious, some contemporary thinkers have compared the modern American prison system to, and especially the system of prison labor, which some have referred to as prison slavery, as a continuation of, like historical American slavery. Is this something that you would characterize as a continuation or a vestige of racial feudalism or some other phenomenon?
Great question. So I have a good friend and colleague at the Society of Fellows who's actually working on this very question. He's doing a history of slavery in the United States, or worldwide actually, but his particular focus is on solitary confinement. And so he looks at solitary confinement as it evolved from medieval times up to the present. And so there's a certain penance that takes place, the way that the prisons are structured as medieval residences, so on and so forth. So I think an argument could be made. There's so many excellent scholars that are doing prison studies that I respect greatly, but I haven't pursued that in my route. But I certainly would hope that something like this could be useful to them as they begin to understand the role of prisons and its legacy, its deeper legacy before the 1500s.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
Slightly off point, maybe a little bit, but one of the things that, as you talk about the aristocracy that feudalism was all about, maybe, just in my mind, one of the biggest issues that they have, that they use tactically to continue this idea up until today, is fear. They use fear from the beginning, from Douglas's time before that. I must fear you because you're different than me. And it has been, brought up all the time. I remember when I was a kid, in Ohio, we have racial problems. foundation of it was people telling me that I fear change, blacks, moving into your neighborhood, all that kind of stuff, which is certainly prevalent today. You see it on the news right now, using fear as a tactic. Did Douglas have any point of view on that, as we're talking about being aware, identity aware of how other people think? Did he have any thoughts or anything that you would feel he would think about that fear that's always being used against liberalism?
Excellent question. Yes, I think fear, you've nailed it. I think this is Richard Wright, who says they don't know me, so they shoot me because they shoot what they don't understand, right? And I think that we need to be skeptical of fear and try to understand why we're feeling these certain emotions. And I can provide a positive example of fear in Douglas when he turns to Covey and he handles his business. And I think that it's that type of fearlessness, that allows you to get attacked as you're giving a talk by members of the audience, and then to come back and then to do that speech. And again, I think Douglas's life is more than just the speeches, but it's also recognizing the courage and the freedom from fear that he displayed in his role as a speaker, as a father, as a recruiter for people to join the military, that we should pay attention to and hold up as a key aspect of Frederick Douglass's life. So thank you for allowing me to reflect on that in his writings.
Might there be any others? If not, we'll have Dr. Roy with us for a bit more. As you came into the room, the publications were on a table just outside, and we'll be up here towards the front making our way. But if not, thank you all for being in this conversation and in this space.